Imagine the entire intellectual inheritance of Western civilization, Greek philosophy, Roman law, Latin grammar, medical knowledge, reduced to a single shelf, not a library, a shelf. That's roughly what survived the 2 centuries after Rome fell. And the people who saved even that much had never seen Rome. Between 550 and 750 AD, the entire surviving corpus of Western knowledge shrank to just 264 manuscripts. Only 26 of those were non-religious, 8 on law, 8 on medicine, 6 on grammar, 4 on other subjects, 0 on philosophy, 0 on history, 0 on poetry. This wasn't a sample of what existed, this was everything. So how did we get to just 264 manuscripts? After the philosopher Boethius was executed around 524 AD, and Italy was devastated by decades of war, the institutional infrastructure for learning collapsed. Monasteries existed, but St. Benedict's rule treated reading as spiritual penance, not scholarship. The critical shift came from Cassiodorus, a retired Roman statesman who founded a monastery in the 540s, built around a different idea. Preserving books was itself a sacred act. But even with dedicated monks, survival depended on something more basic: material technology. Most earlier texts were written on papyrus, plant fiber that rots, tears, and crumbles, especially in damp European climates. Around 400 AD, a dual transition began. Writers shifted from papyrus to parchment, writing material made from animal skin, far more durable, and from scrolls to codices, meaning bound books with pages you can flip through. Without this shift, even those 264 manuscripts would not exist. Now, the surprising part, right? Ireland was never part of the Roman Empire. Christianity arrived there through missionaries, and with it, Latin. But here's the paradox. Because Irish monks had no spoken Latin tradition, they had to learn it systematically from grammar books as a purely foreign language. On the continent, speakers of what was becoming Proto-French or Proto-Spanish thought they were still speaking Latin. They weren't. Their spoken language was diverging rapidly from classical norms, and those errors crept into their written copies. Irish monks didn't have this problem. Their Latin was bookish, precise, and correct, precisely because they never heard it spoken on a Roman street. Meanwhile, English monasteries, particularly in Northumbria, home of the Venerable Bede, the great scholar and historian, became major centers of manuscript copying. It was here that the scriptorium took its mature form, a dedicated room in a monastery where monks spent their days writing and copying texts, not praying, not farming, copying. And this was intellectual labor treated as institutional priority. But preserving books on an island at the edge of the known world came with severe limitations. The largest known library in pre-Carolingian northern England held perhaps 100 to 120 books. That was the biggest collection. Most monasteries had far fewer, maybe a dozen. Every single book was hand-copied. Every copy took weeks or months. A single fire, a single Viking raid, a single flood could erase an entire tradition. The 264 surviving manuscripts aren't a statistical sample. They are essentially everything that made it through. Manuscripts didn't stay in one place. Evidence shows constant communication between England and Italy, the source of most classical texts. Missionaries traveling between these regions carried books with them. This wasn't a formal postal system. It was an ad hoc intellectual network held together by religious devotion and personal relationships. A monk traveling from Northumbria to Rome might carry a manuscript south and return with a different one. These fragile informal connections were the circulatory system of early medieval learning, thin threads of exchange stretching across a continent where most roads had fallen into ruin. Here is the key conceptual twist. Proximity to Rome hurt Latin quality. A Frankish monk in 650 AD spoke something that sounded like Latin to him but was Proto-French. When he copied a manuscript, he might correct classical Latin to match his own speech, introducing errors he couldn't even detect. An Irish monk who learned Latin purely from Donatus's grammar and the Vulgate Bible had no such temptation. No spoken interference, no unconscious corrections. Distance from Rome was paradoxically an advantage. This fragile network, a few hundred monks, a few dozen monasteries, 100 books in the biggest library, was the foundation on which everything that came next was built. When Charlemagne launched his educational reforms in the late 700s, he recruited Alcuin of York, an Englishman trained in this insular tradition, to lead them. The standardization of script, the systematic copying programs, the revival of classical learning, all of it drew on what the margins had preserved. Civilizational knowledge is not self-sustaining. It requires material technology, parchment, not papyrus. It requires institutional commitment, scriptoria, not just prayer, and it requires human dedication, monks copying texts they may not have fully understood. The survival of Western learning was not inevitable. It was contingent on a few hundred people in a few dozen monasteries on the rainy edges of Europe, 264 manuscripts, 26 secular texts. That's the margin by which Western civilization remembered itself.